Good morning, everybody. And this right here, this is the story that's got the entire tech world and the entire national security world talking at the exact same time, which almost never happens. Iran says it just blew up Amazon. Not an Amazon warehouse, not a delivery van, the actual central data infrastructure that powers a huge chunk of the Gulf's cloud computing sitting in Bahrain. And normally, I'd tell you to take an IRGC claim with a grain of salt the size of Casham Island, but this one's got layers. So stick with me, because the US military's answer to this one is not what anybody expected. And we're going to get into exactly why in a minute. But first, let's set the table. The IRGC's aerospace force put out a statement through their state-linked outlets. Tasnim, Fars, IRNA, take your pick. They all said basically the same thing. They said several cruise missiles slammed into what they called Amazon's central data infrastructure in Bahrain, and they said it was destroyed. Not damaged, not disrupted, destroyed. That's a big claim to make about a data center that's owned by an American publicly traded company worth more than most countries' GDP. And here's the kicker. They said this was retaliation for the US strike a day earlier on the Darkovin nuclear power plant, which, and this is important, is still under construction. It's not an operational reactor. It's a construction site in Khuzestan province that Iran's Atomic Energy Organization says got hit by multiple projectiles. So basically, Iran's saying, you hit our future nuclear plant, we're going to hit your cloud. Which, if you think about it, is a very 2026 way to fight a war. Nobody's storming beaches anymore. They're storming server racks. So let's talk about what we actually know versus what Iran wants you to believe, because there's a massive gap between those two things right now. Bahraini officials haven't confirmed a single detail of this. Amazon hasn't said a word publicly. The Pentagon and CENTCOM have both stayed quiet on it too. And when I say quiet, I mean crickets. That's usually a tell. When something huge actually happens, US Central Command tends to put something out fairly quickly, at least a general statement. When it's dead silent like this, that tells me either they're still assessing the damage, or there wasn't much damage to assess in the first place. And I'll tell you which one I'm leaning toward in a second. But here's the thing that's wild to me. This is not the first time Iran has gone after this exact facility. Back in early March, Shahed drones and missiles hit 2 AWS data centers over in the UAE, and this same commercial facility in Bahrain. And that knocked things into what Amazon's own health dashboard called hard down status for weeks. Then in April, another drone hit the same Bahrain site again after a fresh round of US strikes. So Iran's basically going back to the same, well, a third time here, and that tells me something important. If you have to keep hitting the same target because you're not sure the first two hits actually worked, that's not exactly a flex. That's more like swinging at a piñata that's already empty. Because here's what the AWS dashboard has actually shown for months now. That whole Middle East Bahrain region, ME South 1, has been marked disrupted since March. Amazon quietly shifted customer workloads off of it a long time ago, specifically so a strike like this wouldn't take anything meaningful offline. So even if Iran's cruise missiles did hit something concrete in Bahrain, and hey, that part is plausible, given how many strikes have landed in that country over the last 10 days, the actual mission impact on Amazon's cloud services is probably close to zero at this point, because there's nothing critical left running there to break. It's the digital equivalent of bombing a building after everybody already moved out. You can absolutely level the structure. That doesn't mean you accomplished the objective. Now let's go to the imagery review section, my friends, because I want to show you guys where we're actually talking about here. So let's pop over and take a look at Bahrain real quick. If we zoom out, you can see Bahrain sitting right there in the Persian Gulf, tiny island nation, but it punches way above its weight class because it's home to the US Navy's 5th Fleet. And it's also become this massive commercial and cloud hub for the entire Gulf region. So when Iran says they hit Amazon's infrastructure here, they're basically saying they hit a piece of the digital plumbing that runs financial institutions, government agencies, businesses all across the region. That's actually a smart target if you're trying to send a message, because it's not just military, it's economic. It's the kind of target that makes CEOs nervous, not just generals. But when we zoom into where these AWS facilities typically sit, you'll notice they're built into industrial parks, not hardened bunkers. There's no 1,000 feet of reinforced rock over the top of a server farm. So unlike when we're talking about a GBU-57 going after a mountain in Isfahan, hitting a data center doesn't take some exotic penetrator weapon. Cruise missile, drone, whatever they used. If it actually connected, it would do damage to the building. The real question was never whether they could hit it. The real question is whether hitting it actually did anything, and based on the fact that Amazon has had this region flagged as disrupted since March, and already moved the important stuff off of it, my read is Iran just spent a few very expensive cruise missiles blowing up what's basically an empty house. And Iran also claimed in the same breath that they hit US air defense systems and radar installations in the areas of Muharraq and Riffa, and that they hit the Sheikh Isa Air Base, which, by the way, is a legitimate logistical hub for the U.S. military over there. So they're bundling a real verified strike area, the air base, in with a much shakier claim, the Amazon data center, and hoping the credibility of one rubs off on the other. That's a pretty classic IRGC move, honestly. Mix your confirmed hit with your unconfirmed one, and let state media blur the line. NPR actually reported that Iran hit that same Sheikh Isa Air Base as part of this broader wave. So there is a real piece of military infrastructure in the mix here. It's not all smoke and mirrors. It's just that the Amazon piece specifically is the one nobody outside of Iranian state media has been able to verify. Now, before we keep going, I gotta tell you guys about something, because I don't want to lose my train of thought later. This right here is exactly why I wrote the book. Because when you're in a fight like this one, whether it's a nation-state fight, or it's your career, or your business, the guy who screams the loudest claim isn't always the guy who's actually winning. Sometimes the loudest claim is a smokescreen for the fact that you're losing ground everywhere else. That's a lesson that applies just as much in a boardroom as it does in a war room. And that's the kind of stuff I break down in The Art of Modern War. You can head over to MabBook.com right now and grab a copy, signed or unsigned, while the signed ones are still available, because once those are gone, they're gone. I really appreciate everybody who's picked up a copy so far. It means a lot. All right, back to the mountain of information here, because we've got a lot to get through. So here's where the nobody saw this coming part actually comes in, and this is the part I think a lot of outlets are underselling, because you'd expect, after a claim like Iran just blew up Amazon's cloud in Bahrain, the US response would be some kind of symbolic strike on an equivalent target, an eye for an eye, hit one of their data centers or telecom hubs, if they even have anything comparable left standing at this point. That's the obvious move. That's the move most people were expecting. Instead, what actually happened is CENTCOM didn't respond to the Amazon claim specifically at all. They didn't dignify it with a statement. What they did instead was keep grinding forward on a much bigger campaign that had already been running for 10 straight nights at that point, hitting Iranian military capability tied to shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, and simultaneously, the Pentagon quietly started surging additional F-16 and F-35 squadrons into the region, along with a wave of aerial refueling tankers. So, while Iran's state media was busy trying to make headlines about Amazon, the actual US posture move was reinforcing for a much longer fight, not retaliating for a data center. That's the nobody saw coming part. Everybody was watching to see if the Pentagon would swing back at the cloud claim, and instead, the Pentagon effectively shrugged, said nothing, and kept adding jets to the board like they're setting up for overtime, not making a single symbolic gesture. And think about what that actually signals if you're sitting in Tehran right now. If the US had responded specifically to the Amazon claim, that would have told Iran their message landed, that hitting American commercial infrastructure gets a reaction. Silence combined with reinforcement sends a completely different message. It says we don't need to respond to your claims one at a time. We're just going to keep scaling the entire operation until this ends on our terms. That's honestly a more unsettling response if you're Iranian leadership than a tit-for-tat strike would have been, because a tit-for-tat strike gives you a data point to work with. Silence plus reinforcement gives you nothing to work with except more incoming jets. Now let's talk about how we actually got to this point, because the timeline here matters a lot. Back in June, there was a memorandum of understanding, a real ceasefire framework, that was supposed to bring this whole thing to a formal close within 60 days. And for a few weeks, it mostly held. Then on July 7th, Iran struck 3 commercial vessels that were using the pre-approved southern route through Omani waters, the exact route that had been negotiated specifically so commercial ships could avoid Iranian harassment. And that was the trigger. The following day, President Trump declared the ceasefire over, and CENTCOM stepped its strikes back up hard. Since then, we've had night after night after night of strikes, hitting command centers, coastal radar, missile and drone facilities, and increasingly economic targets, bridges, rail lines, refineries, the stuff that keeps a war machine funded and supplied rather than just the war machine itself. By the time we got to this latest stretch, we were sitting at 10 consecutive nights of strikes, and Iran had been retaliating by hitting US-linked facilities all across the Gulf, Bahrain, Kuwait, Jordan, with reports of strikes reaching into Syria and Iraq as well. And this is the stretch where things got personal because American service members actually died. 2 US soldiers were killed in Jordan, and a 3rd service member's death was confirmed as well, the first US military fatalities from Iranian fire since March. President Trump came out and said Iran would pay for that. And I'm going to paraphrase here rather than quote it word for word, but the gist of what he said was that Tehran would pay many times over for those deaths. That's not a symbolic statement when you consider what came right after it, which was the strike on the Darkhaven nuclear facility under construction, and then Iran's Amazon claim as their answer to that. So if we lay the sequence out in order, it goes something like this. Ceasefire breaks down after Iran hits ships on the safe route. Trump declares the ceasefire over. CENTCOM ramps, strikes back up night after night. American troops die in Jordan. Trump vows retribution. The U.S. hits the Darkhaven nuclear construction site. Iran claims they destroyed Amazon's cloud infrastructure in Bahrain in response. And the U.S. answers that entire claim with total silence, while quietly loading more fighter jets and tankers into the theater. That's 8 moves on the chessboard in about 2 weeks, and every single one of Iran's moves has been a reaction to something the U.S. already did first. That's not the posture of a side that's controlling the tempo of this war. That's the posture of a side that's constantly playing catch-up and trying to find a headline that makes it look otherwise. Let's pop over to the global roundup section, my friends, because there's some other pieces of this puzzle you need to know about. First, the money. Brent crude climbed above $90 a barrel as this latest round of strikes and counterstrikes played out, and U.S. crude wasn't far behind it. That's the oil market pricing in real fear about the Strait of Hormuz specifically, because that's the artery that a huge percentage of the world's oil supply has to pass through. And every time Iran talks about closing it or attacking ships in it, traders get twitchy. Second, and this one made me laugh honestly, in the exact same news cycle where Iran was claiming they destroyed Amazon's cloud infrastructure, Bitcoin and XRP were both rallying, up a couple percent apiece, testing resistance levels, completely unbothered by the fact that a Gulf War was supposedly just torching American tech infrastructure. Markets have a funny way of telling you what they actually believe versus what the headlines say, and crypto traders apparently were not losing much sleep over the IRGC's press release. Third, and this is a real one, the Trump administration is reportedly asking Congress for billions of dollars in emergency funding to keep this operation running, which tells you this isn't being treated as a short punitive campaign anymore. This is being budgeted like a sustained operation. Fourth, while all of this is happening, diplomats haven't completely given up. Iran's interior minister actually traveled to Pakistan for talks, one of the mediating countries alongside Qatar, trying to find some kind of off-ramp back toward reviving the ceasefire framework. So you've got missiles flying and diplomats shaking hands in the same 48-hour window, which, if you've been watching this conflict for any length of time, you know is basically the entire rhythm of how this thing has operated from the start. And one more thing for the roundup, because I think this is actually one of the more underappreciated threads in this whole story. Iran has been explicitly threatening a much wider list of American tech companies beyond Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, Google, and even OpenAI's enormous Stargate data center project over in Dubai that's backed by a consortium including Oracle, NVIDIA, Cisco, and SoftBank. So what Iran is signaling here, whether the Amazon claim itself holds up under scrutiny or not, is a strategic intent to treat American commercial cloud and AI infrastructure across the entire Gulf as a legitimate target set going forward. That's a genuinely new front in this conflict compared to where things stood back in the spring. It used to be almost entirely military bases, ships, and radar sites. Now, the target list explicitly includes the buildings that host the servers running half the region's businesses, and possibly some of the most important AI infrastructure being built on the planet right now. That's a much bigger deal, long-term, than one contested claim about one data center in Bahrain. Let me also walk you through the actual mechanics of why a claim like this is so easy to make and so hard to verify in real time. Because I think that's the part a lot of people watching this conflict from the outside don't fully appreciate. When a fighter jet strikes a runway or a radar site, you can usually get satellite imagery within 24 to 48 hours that either confirms a crater and debris pattern or doesn't. Commercial satellite companies sell that imagery, open source analysts pull it, and within a couple days you generally have a pretty clear yes or no. A data center is a completely different animal. From the outside, a data center building can take a direct hit, lose a generator, lose a cooling unit, take shrapnel damage to an exterior wall, and from a satellite photo 40,000 feet up, it can look almost identical to a data center that wasn't touched at all, because the actual damage that matters, the racks, the switches, the fiber runs, all of that is inside a windowless box. So Iran gets to make a maximalist claim, destroyed central infrastructure, several cruise missiles, and the rest of the world is stuck waiting on either Amazon's own internal engineering teams to say something, which they have zero incentive to do quickly since admitting damage could spook customers, or on Bahraini officials, who also have limited incentive to confirm a foreign missile successfully hit a target on their own soil. So you end up with this fog where the claim gets to sit out there uncontested for days, maybe longer, just doing its propaganda job in the silence. That's actually a pretty efficient use of a small number of missiles if your actual goal is the headline rather than the outage. And I want to go back to the imagery for a second because there's a piece of this that's been bugging me. When you look at the pattern of strikes Iran has run against this exact region going back to March, the UAE data centers, the Bahrain commercial facility, Then April's follow-up drone strike on the same Bahrain site. Then this cruise missile claim in July. That's 3 separate attempts against basically the same target set in about 4.5 months. In fighter pilot terms, when you keep re-rolling weapons onto a target you've already claimed as destroyed, that tells your own command one of 2 things. Either your battle damage assessment the first 2 times was wrong and the target kept coming back online, or your battle damage assessment was accurate and you're just restriking symbolic value rather than actual military value at this point. Given that Amazon had already flagged that region as disrupted and had already migrated customer workloads off of it well before this latest strike, I'm leaning heavily toward option 2. This is a target Iran keeps returning to because it makes a good headline, not because there's meaningful capability sitting there to destroy a 3rd time. Now let's go back to the global roundup for a second, because there's a few more threads worth pulling on. Kuwait's electricity ministry reported fires breaking out at several power and water desalination plants after a separate round of Iranian strikes hit the country, which matters a lot more than it sounds like on paper, because desalination is not a luxury in the Gulf. It's literally how a huge percentage of the population gets drinking water. That's the kind of target that starts to generate real humanitarian pressure on all sides if it keeps escalating. Separately, Bahrain's Civil Aviation Authority confirmed that Iran had targeted the country's civil air navigation systems just a day before the Amazon claim came out, though they said operations at the airport itself weren't affected. So you're seeing a pattern here where Iran is trying to hit dual-use infrastructure, things that serve both civilian and military or economic functions, power, water, navigation, cloud computing, probably because purely military targets have been getting hammered so hard for over a week straight that there's simply less of that left standing to hit back at. You made it to the 40 Chess Strategic Analysis section, my friends. So let's pull all of this apart and figure out what it actually tells us. Iran needed a win this week. They lost a nuclear construction site to American bombs. They've lost pilots, radar sites, coastal defenses, command centers night after night for over a week straight, and 3 of their own people took direct hits from failed intercepts on top of everything else going on. Against that backdrop, claiming you destroyed Amazon's cloud infrastructure is a cheap, low-risk way to manufacture a headline win when your actual battlefield wins are getting harder and harder to find. It costs Iran nothing to make the claim. If it turns out to be exaggerated or flat-out false, which based on the AWS dashboard history and the total silence from Amazon and Bahrain looks pretty likely, there's no real accountability for that inside Iran's own information ecosystem. State media just moves on to the next claim. But here's the strategic problem with leaning that hard on information warfare. Every time you make a big claim that doesn't hold up, and this would be the 3rd strike on this exact same facility if we're keeping score, you erode your own credibility a little more with every outside observer, every intelligence agency, every journalist who's been tracking the string of claims since March. Eventually the well runs dry, and when you actually do land a real hit that matters, nobody outside your own state media apparatus is going to believe you anymore. That's the boy who cried wolf problem, except in this case, it's the regime who claimed the cloud outage. Meanwhile, the US response pattern tells its own story. Silence on the claim itself, sustained tempo on the strikes that are actually verified and actually degrading Iranian capability, and a quiet reinforcement of the theater with more fighters and more tankers. That's not the behavior of a military command that's rattled by a data center claim. That's the behavior of a command that's settled into a long campaign rhythm and isn't going to get pulled off that rhythm by a press release from Tehran. If anything, the biggest tell here might be what didn't happen. No emergency statement, no symbolic strike on an Iranian equivalent target, no shift in messaging at all. Just more of the same relentless nightly pressure that's already been running for 10 straight days, and a force posture buildup that suggests the Pentagon is planning for this to go longer, not wind down. So where does this actually go from here? You've got mediators in Pakistan trying to find a diplomatic thread to pull. You've got oil markets pricing and continued instability. You've got a target list on the Iranian side that's now explicitly expanding into commercial tech infrastructure across the whole Gulf. And you've got an American military posture that looks a lot more like it's settling in for the long haul than looking for an exit. All of that tells me this is not close to over. And if Iran keeps needing to manufacture claims like this one to keep the narrative alive domestically, that alone tells you a lot about how the actual fight on the ground is going for them. There's one more angle here that I think deserves its own moment, and it's the AI infrastructure piece. Because I don't think people fully grasp how much has shifted in just the last year or two in terms of what actually sits inside a Gulf data center now. This isn't 2015, where a regional cloud region is just hosting some websites and email servers for local banks. These facilities increasingly host the compute that trains and runs artificial intelligence workloads for companies and governments across multiple continents. That Stargate project in Dubai, that Iran has already put on notice, the one backed by OpenAI, Oracle, NVIDIA, Cisco, G42, and SoftBank, That's not a side project. That's a multi-billion-dollar bet on AI infrastructure sitting in a region that is currently an active war zone. If Iran, or any actor in this conflict, ever did land a real confirmed hit on something at that scale, that wouldn't just be a regional story, that would move markets in San Francisco and Tokyo the same afternoon. So even though this particular Amazon claim looks shaky when you hold it up against the evidence, the fact that Iran is explicitly signaling this entire category of target, cloud, AI, commercial tech as fair game going forward is genuinely one of the more significant strategic shifts to come out of this stretch of the war, regardless of whether Tuesday's specific claim holds up. And it raises a question that I don't think anybody in Washington has fully answered publicly yet, which is what actually counts as an attack on American interests, serious enough to trigger a direct military response when the target isn't a base or a ship, but a privately owned server farm. If a foreign government successfully destroys a data center owned by an American company, operating on foreign soil, servicing customers across a dozen different countries, is that treated as an attack on the company, an attack on the host nation, or an attack on the United States itself? Right now, it looks like the answer coming out of the Pentagon is effectively none of the above, at least not one that gets a dedicated response on its own. It just gets folded into the broader nightly campaign that's already running. That's worth sitting with for a second, because as more and more of what matters strategically moves off of runways and into racks of servers, the rules of engagement for this stuff are still being figured out in real time. And Iran testing that ambiguity with these repeated data center claims might be as much about probing where that line actually sits as it is about the tactical value of the strike itself. Let's also talk briefly about what the reinforcement piece actually tells you about how long the Pentagon thinks this goes. Sending additional F-16 and F-35 squadrons isn't something you do for a strike package that wraps up in a few more days. Fighter squadrons take time to spin up logistically in a new theater. Ground crews, munition stockpiles, basing agreements with host nations, all of that has to be worked out well before the jets themselves show up. Tankers matter even more here, because without enough aerial refueling capacity, you physically cannot sustain the tempo of nightly strikes deep into Iranian territory that we've already seen for over a week straight. So when you see a wave of additional tankers arriving in Israel and additional fighters coming in from bases in Europe, that's not posturing for a headline. That's the unglamorous logistical backbone of a military that is planning to keep this pace up for weeks, not days. Compare that to Iran's information response, a press release claiming a data center got destroyed, and you start to see just how mismatched the two sides' actual capacity to sustain this fight really is right now. What do you guys think? Do you think Amazon's Bahrain facility actually took a real hit this time? Or do you think this was another exaggerated claim layered on top of a real strike on the airbase next door? Do you think the US keeps ignoring these commercial infrastructure claims? Or does a real strike on American-owned tech assets eventually force a direct response? Do you think the additional F-16s and F-35s and all those tankers rolling into theater tell you this war has months left in it rather than weeks? And do you think Iran keeps expanding this target list toward tech and AI infrastructure across the Gulf? Or do you think that's a line even they eventually pull back from once the diplomats in Pakistan and Qatar get further along? Let me know what you think in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and I love hearing what you guys think is coming next. One last thing before I let you go, because I think it's worth saying plainly. None of this makes the underlying war any less serious for the people actually living through it on either side of the Gulf. Real service members have died in this latest stretch. Real Iranian civilians are dealing with power and water disruptions from strikes hitting infrastructure near them. And real commercial ships and their crews are the ones stuck navigating a waterway that keeps getting more dangerous by the week. It's easy to get caught up in the information war side of this, the competing claims, the propaganda, the headline chasing, because honestly, that's the part that moves fastest and generates the most content day to day. But underneath all of that noise, there's an actual shooting war grinding on night after night. And I never want to lose sight of that just because this particular episode happened to be about a data center instead of a runway. All right, go ahead and follow me over on Pepperbox. I'm posting stuff over there you're not going to find anywhere else. And I'm also on X and Instagram pretty much every single day. And if you haven't already, head over to mabbook.com and grab a copy of The Art of Modern War, signed while they last. And while you're at it, go sign up over at Max Afterburner Energy. That's my energy drink company. It's my baby, and it's built specifically so you don't get the 2 o'clock crash. No jitters, no heartburn, just locked in focus, whether you're flying a jet or just trying to get through your Wednesday. Totally free to join the email list, and you'll get updates the second the cans and the merch drop.